While being bored at work, I drew a scheme of the way how the capitalist economy worked, and even though I had developed a clear sense of the kinds of problems that plague us, I was once again reminded very clearly and simply what the problem is. The essential problem, which has not really changed during human history, is that a few elites hold on to most of the economic resources and try to make sure that it stays this way, even if they actually do not earn it and many people still live in poverty. Why is inequality growing as the rich are getting richer, while workers are being screwed, unemployment is high, and wages are stagnant or falling in some cases? The capitalist economy has at its basis the exploitation of labor. Workers get paid less than the value they produce for their employer. Whatever value the worker produces, the less the wages he gets is called the surplus value. That surplus value is absorbed by the capitalist employer so he can make investments to generate more profits in the future. That is a simple Marxian model. If you add the growth of the financial sector to that, then it becomes somewhat more complicated because of the fictitious value that is embedded in financial capital. In that model, an increasing share of the economy gets swallowed up into the financial sector, leading to cartels and monopolies, and fewer resources are devoted to real goods producing industries because the relative profits are lower. The financial model of the economy has been developed by Rudolf Hilferding if you want to read about it. The reason why the exploitation of labor is so interesting to study is naturally because very few economists, social scientists, politicians, businessmen, and journalists bother to analyze the economy in this way. And since we may consider the exploitation condition to be so central to our current economic order, it is only appropriate to want to analyze it in that way. Unfortunately, what is more likely going to happen is to have more people accept the current social order and focus on smaller problems in order to blame whatever problems that do exist. But it is not just intellectual satisfaction which encourages the critical study of capitalism. The current economic system produces an enormous amount of wealth, but also produces an enormous amount of inequality and poverty. We're producing more food than there are people on Earth, and yet 842 million people suffered from chronic hunger between 2011 and 2013. The richest 85 people in the world own as much wealth as the poorest 3.5 billion people combined. Among OECD countries, the share of national income going to workers decreased from 66% in the 1990s to 62% in the 2000s. In the United States, 95% of all income gains between 2009 and 2012 went to the richest 1% of society. These data points make it very clear that wanting to critique the system is urgently necessary in order to think about policies that can ameliorate these social inequalities that confront us in the 21st century. Inequality itself is an important subject to study as well, because there seems to be growing evidence that rising inequality may contribute to lower rates of economic growth. Since much of the capital is siphoned off into speculative investments in the financial sector, which are not productive, and the very wealthy consume only a small share of what a broad middle class would consume if the middle class was still strong. But we know that middle class is weak because of the huge inequality. Less investments in the real goods and service producing industry and low levels of aggregate demand are really bad signs for workers across the world because that puts a downward pressure on employment and wages, which is superbly ironic because the income paid out as a result of work and labor is the main way for workers to share in the gains of productivity and economic growth. Since the data tells us that the labor share of income is declining while the capital share is increasing, we should not be surprised that income and wealth inequality has increased correspondingly. Now let me go over some more reasons why we see an increasing trend towards inequality. First, let's think about globalization. With the development of information, communication, and transportation technology, the capitalists of the world were now able to exploit global labor and natural resources, and are no longer dependent on their respective nation states, thereby making local labor in rich countries redundant, which puts a downward pressure on wages and in some cases employment. Globalization has many meanings, and there's a whole academic literature to study this. For example, the expansion of McDonald's or Hollywood culture across the whole world. And these are definitely important aspects, but the key factor I want to focus on here is the availability of cheap labor any place in the world. Of course, capitalists won't go any place because otherwise dirt cheap countries like in sub-Saharan Africa would have full employment by now. But we know this is not the case. There have to be certain institutional features that need to be in place in order to attract investors to come in, for example, in East and Southeast Asia and Latin America. We also have seen the prevalence of anti-socialist and anti-statist rhetoric since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which has also encouraged further global flows of capital. Some people would object that not only was globalization bad for you as workers, but it was also good for you as consumers, because the products are sold cheaper. Well, there's a small amount of truth in that statement. Um, One of the things that had completely taken me by surprise was that when I went to the stores, you know the clothing was surprisingly cheap because they were all import wear, while locally sourced services like healthcare and education remained really expensive. But aside from that direct comparison, we should notice also that many goods are still more expensive than they could be, and that has to do with the market power of a few large firms. Literature by Baran and Sweezy describes the state as monopoly capitalism, and we certainly do very much live in a monopoly capitalist world, which is really a long-running tendency, where competition, which is a key pillar of liberal economics, eventually leads to market consolidation. The second factor we should consider is technology. While globalization only leads to the displacement of local labor, which has created all kinds of nativist sentiments among the Western working class, technology has the potential to be globally labor displacing. Here I would like to raise the example of the farmers. One farmer used to be able to feed himself and his family at most, but today a farmer can feed himself and 100 other people, which allows those 100 other people to do other jobs. It is certainly feasible today that workers can find jobs in many other industries when the machine displaces them. But I think that given the high rates of unemployment and the low labor participation rates we find in many developed countries, I very much doubt that the regular economy continues to have much demand for those displaced workers. Some people would object that we can't go that far in displacement because technology, while being error-free in routine tasks, cannot equal humans in terms of doing cognitive level tasks. But I would not underestimate the potential for rapid improvements. Sooner or later, the factor labor becomes too expensive for capitalists, and if the opportunity for displacement by machines exists, capitalists at least want to try it. Some people also object that technology is labor complementing rather than labor substituting. But I think this is only true for a very small group of jobs, like let's say doctors who use electronic medical records or teachers that teach online courses. What we really see is the disappearance of middle class jobs, especially if they are of a routine nature, which leads to a labor polarization. That means that we have a schism of a small pool of relatively high wage jobs, and we have a large pool of relatively low wage jobs, and almost no jobs in between. The high end jobs remain hard to automate, and so technology in this case is indeed labor complementing. The low wage jobs are also thus far really hard to automate, and even if it were feasible to be automated, it is not economically reasonable because the cost of machine still exceeds that of low-cost labor. In the meantime, the winners of this arrangement are clearly the owners of the technology, such as Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, who can use the technology and earn billions of dollars in monopoly profits, while the companies they control only hire very few people. And remember that low labor costs means more profits for owners. Many technology vendors are also selling the products to corporations to help them monitor and control workers, which in a very tailored sense might be good for the bottom line and for increasing productivity, but it is very alienating for the workers as well. We also want to consider financial deregulation as a third factor for increased inequality. Since the deregulation of Wall Street, many of these financial firms have massively expanded their scope such that more and more parts of the economy are shaped by very short-term profit maximization considerations at the expense of more prudent long-term financial thinking, such as investing in worker training and higher wages to attract better talent. Firms are under permanent cost pressure as the financial firms and investors increasingly dictate the decisions that they have to make, including downsizing, layoffs, and more low-wage and contract work arrangements. That also increases inequality. As financial innovation leads to more ways to produce revenues for financial firms, they directly compete for investor money that would have otherwise gone to real goods and service producing industries. The firms are therefore even more inclined to maximize profits, pay out a high amount to shareholders, and do share buybacks, which does nothing to expand business operations and hire workers. Weak overall demand for labor leads to downward pressure in wages and more inequality. Finally, financial deregulation has allowed more speculation in all kinds of sectors, but most importantly in housing and residential investments. Those speculative investments make a few very wealthy owners even more wealthy because they can snap up a lot of property, versus many other people that are poorer just can't afford these houses and don't benefit from an increase in residential prices. In a short time, when in fact such a strategy of giving mortgages to people who could otherwise not afford it had been pursued in the early 2000s, this has led to the biggest financial crisis since the 1920s. The resulting recession, bank bailout, and austerity measures have led to even more redistribution from the bottom to the top. Student loan debt, credit card debt, housing debt, medical debt, and government debt are higher than ever, and that by necessity benefits the rich creditors. Finally, we want to look at the fact that it takes money to make money. A few people who own lots of capital are able to buy up a lot of houses, a lot of shares of companies, and therefore they get richer. Those in the middle class and lower class are not able, they're not educated enough, and even if they were, they just don't have the capital to make those kinds of investments and cannot benefit from an increase in asset prices. Also, we have to consider the political power of the rich. The fact that the wealthy, once they have benefited from all those other things, will try to cement their economic wealth by attaining political influence. They will buy up politicians, legislators, presidents, Congress, etc., administrators, in order to make sure that there's going to be more favorable tax and subsidy policies in order to cement their economic wealth, and also that they will try to prevent any kinds of pro-poor redistributive policies in the near future. That, in fact, is a real problem. One example is the story of the Koch brothers, who are spending hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign contributions to promote a right-wing agenda of corporate tax cuts, environmental pollution, and anti-labor policies, which clearly reveals the intent of those billionaires to retain and reinforce the extreme status quo of extreme inequality.